Hi there. This is a video response to Once Forgiven, Now Free and his conversation between abusive anti-theist. The reason I'm making this video is because I find it pretty annoying that people who don't know anything about information theory attempt to use this information argument to argue against evolution, and they literally don't know what they're talking about. So I'm going to address the misconceptions that this guy has, and hopefully next time somebody brings up an information argument, you could use this, or hopefully these kinds of arguments don't come up again, because they're really stupid. So his first misconception or argument is that evolution, mutation, natural selection cannot add or produce new information. The easiest way to respond to this is that anybody who claims this will never tell you if they know how to measure information. That is universally true, because once a person can tell you how he can measure information, he can no longer make this argument. It's only when people don't know how to measure information that they'll say, you can't produce new information. Well, obviously, because they don't know, even if you did produce new information, how to recognize it. The easiest way to test whether somebody knows what he's talking about is look here in my comments box. I will leave you a few different text boxes, and I want you to tell me whether you can tell which one of these text boxes contains more information. If you can't answer this question, then please shut the F up next time when you say something cannot produce new information or there's no new information, because you don't even know how to recognize new information. You don't even know when I give you these simple text blocks, yeah, simple, that whether there's a difference between the amount of information given to you. Now, the second argument, not necessarily made by him, but it's implied in many of these arguments, is that it's very easy to shuffle letters and find useless information. That is true, but you need to keep in mind that meaning is quite subjective. If I don't speak the same language you do, you can give me a book and it would be meaningless to me. Similarly, if I asked you to read DNA and tell me what it means, you would tell me it's meaningless to you. But that does not mean DNA on its own is completely inherently meaningless, because given the right context, to the right people, to the right tools, at the right time, DNA serves the function of providing information for creating life, to put it more simply. His third point that I've noticed is that DNA mutation cannot explain how information got there. This kind of reminds me of Christopher Johnson. He says that, well, if you take a look at a New York City and you see the patterns of cars, does that explain how the car works? Nobody claims that. DNA does not explain how DNA information got there. I agree. Just like paper and ink doesn't explain how letters are printed. And nobody claims that. So why are you making this straw man argument? Then a related argument is that it's statistically impossible to get this sentence. Well, people who say that, again, much like the first argument, will never tell you what is statistically possible. If you ask them, I'll give you the same letters, shuffle them all you want, tell me what is statistically possible. They cannot give you an answer. I mean, if you don't believe me, take a deck of cards and shuffle it and write down the order. I guarantee you the next 1,000 times that you shuffle the same deck of cards, you will not get the same order again. But that is true of any deck of cards at any time you shuffle it. You're just not going to get that combination. So you are right. It's statistically impossible in terms of probability to get this sentence in question, but so is everything else when it comes to this amount of complexity. So this is meaningless. Now, the final argument that I want to respond to And it's hardly an argument because it's just stupid. He says, well, you can't drop ink on paper and get information. The answer is yes, you can. It's just not going to be information that you can read. If you drop ink on paper, you could actually get some information as to how the ink was dropped, at what time, what rate, etc. It's not useful to you, but you see in crime investigations that ink on paper, even if it wasn't purposely written, can provide evidence and indication of certain events. In fact, there's a very famous way of testing a person's handwriting, and that is to see how fast a person writes ink on paper. Because the longer your pen stays on paper, the more time it has to diffuse. So the more diffusion of ink on paper will tell you that a person is taking his time to write something, and that usually is an indication that a person might not be writing in his own handwriting, if that makes any sense. But the reason this argument doesn't work, that you can't just drop ink on paper and get information, is first, yes, you can. But granted, you can't drop ink on paper and get a book. But life and cells and DNA does not start with dropping atoms and getting DNA. What you do start with is ATCG, and you build from there. So please don't use the argument that you can't drop ink on paper and get information, or you can't drop ink on paper and get a book. Try making the argument that you can't drop letters and get a book. And that's a better analogy, but still not quite right. Because once you start with what DNA and life and cells actually are, which is they start with ATCG, then you build from, for lack of a better word, random frequencies of ATCG, then you can get some order and so on. So once you get letters, then you have a higher chance of producing sentences, even if they start out as being meaningless. So once you get these analogies straight, you're no longer able to make these arguments. So please, if you don't know anything about information, don't make these arguments. They're stupid. Thank you.